Hey everybody, it's Mr. Roy. I want to take you through just a little bit of stuff here in section 4.1. So here is our workbook. We're looking at the beginning of chapter 4. So we're going to scroll down. Here's section 4.1. We're going to skip over our warm-up. That's something we did in our tutorial. And I want to go actually all the way down to number 2. And we're going to look at number 2 and 3. So I'm going to switch here to my smartboard. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at a single inch on a ruler or a measuring tape. So if you look at a single inch on a ruler or a measuring tape, usually it's split into 16 parts, sometimes 32 parts if you need one that's really accurate, but usually it's split into 16 pieces. And so on here, each of those 16ths are labeled. We got 1/16, 2/16, 3/16, all the way up to, right at the end, 16/16. And so each of those tick marks, if you were to count them all up, there would be 16 of them. Now we don't always want to reference things in the 16ths. We want to make our fractions that we use when we're measuring inches as simple as possible. So we're going to go through those and then we'll have a look at number 3. Okay, so what we want to kind of look at when we're doing this is we want to make sure that we're looking at the line length. So the longest line right here at the end, that's the full inch. The next longest line between 0 and 1, or between 1 and 2, all those different ones, all the different inches, is the next longest one is going to be the ½ inch line right here. So that's going to be our 1/2 inch. Now here's the thing, we could measure this in 16ths and it would be 8/16 if we were to count them up. And you can actually count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But we want to always write our fractions when we're talking about measurements in simplest terms. This is how people talk about it in everyday life. They wouldn't say something is 2 8/16 inches long. They'd say 2½ inches long. So we always want to reduce our fractions to their simplest form, and this is something we did in class. So how do we do that? We actually divided the top and bottom by 8. Divided 8 by 8 is 1, and 16 divided by 8 is 2. So that's our ½ inch right there. And if we see anything on this longest line in the middle, we know it's going to be a ½ inch. Our next longest line is going to be our quarters. So we've actually got our 1/4, our 2/4, and our 3/4. So I'm going to get a new color here. Here's our 1/4 right here. So that's 1/4 inch if we hit that next longest line. 2/4 would be right here. 2/4, but we don't really call it 2/4, we call it a half. 2/4 and a half are the same thing. They're worth the same amount, but we usually don't call things 2/4. We just call them a half. Next we've got 3/4, which is right here, and then our 4/4 would be the full inch, so that would be right to there. Okay, so if we see something on these next shortest lines, we're going to have it in quarters, either 1/4 or 3/4. If we see next one, I'll do this next one in purple. Half of the size of a quarter is an eighth. So here's our 1/8. Here's our 2/8, but we don't call it 2/8, we call it a quarter. Here's our 3/8. Here's our 4/8, but we don't call it 4/8, we call it a half. Here's our 5/8. Here's our 6/8, but we don't call it 6/8, we reduce it to 3/4. Here's our 7/8. And then one full one is our 8/8, right? So if we're looking for an eighth, we're going to be, if we see that's on one of these, not the shortest tick mark, but the second shortest tick mark, we're going to measure it in eighths. So if something is here, we'll say it's an eighth. If it's here, we say it's 3/8. If it's here, we say it's 5/8. If it's here, we say it's 7/8. Now our smallest one on most measuring tapes is going to be a 16th. So I'm going to do that one in red. So here we already have it written, that's 1/16. This would be 2/16, which is equal to an eighth. Here's 3/16, 4/16, which is equal to a quarter. 5/16, 6/16, which is equal to 3/8. 7/16, 8/16, which is equal to a half. 9/16, 10/16, which is equal to 5/8. 11/16, 12 sixteenths, which is equal to 3/4, 13 sixteenths, 14 sixteenths, which is equal to 7/8, 15 sixteenths, and then all the way to the 1 inch is 16 sixteenths. So let's put those in there. We got our 1 16th, we got our 3 sixteenths, we got our 5 sixteenths, we got our 9 sixteenths because our 7 sixteenths was already written in for us. We got our 11 sixteenths. We got our 13 sixteenths and our 15 sixteenths. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to get rid of some of our extra ones. There, okay, so those are all the ones we have. And so again, our key idea here is if it is the longest line in between an inch, that's a half. If it's the next longest one, that's either a 1/4 or 3/4. If it's the next longest one, that's going to be an eighth, so it's either 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, or 7/8. And if it's the next line shorter than that, it's going to be in sixteenths. 1 16th, 3 16ths, 5 16ths, 7 16ths, 9 16ths, 11 16ths, 13 16ths, and 15 16ths. So really, the first thing you should do when you're measuring something is you look for the main number of inches first. How many inches is it? And then when you're trying to figure out in between, is it like 2? If not, let's say for example something was more than 2 but less than 3. What's the fraction of an inch that we have? You got to look at the lines. Is it on the longest line? Yes or no. Is it on the second longest line? Yes or no. Is it on that set of third longest lines, or is it on the shortest lines? And that'll tell you if it's in the halves, quarters, eighths, or sixteenths. Okay, and once you know, then you can just look at it. Some measuring tapes have this written right on the measuring tape, but many don't. So it's hard to tell if it doesn't have it written on it, and you just need a little bit of practice. Okay, now we're going to use this measuring tape, and we're going to have a look at question number 3. So question number 3 says, I'm going to switch my colors back to blue here. It says half of one inch is a half inch. So here's our full inch right there. Half of it is a half inch right there. How many sixteenths is that? Well, if we look up, we can see that that's 8 sixteenths. And we know that 8 is half of 16, right? So now we say half of a half inch. Well, let's look for that. Here's our half inch. Where's half of that? Half of that would be right here. That's our 1/4 inch, right? So half of 1/2 inch is 1/4. And we'll use these 2 little tick marks to indicate inches. That's a short form for inches. How many sixteenths is that? That's 4 sixteenths. And actually 4 is a 1/4 of 16. 4 4s go into 16. So we can see that 4 sixteenths right up here. Half of a 1/4 inch, so there's our 1/4 inch. What's half of that? It's an eighth right here. So half of our 1/4 inch is 1/8 of an inch. And how many sixteenths is that? It's 2 sixteenths. And again, if we wanted to reduce this into lowest form, we would divide our top and our bottom by 2. Divide the top by 2, we get 1. Divide the bottom by 2, we get 8. So 1/8 of an inch. And last but not least, half of 1/8 of an inch. So here's our 1/8 of an inch. What's half of that? It's right here. It's 1/16 of an inch. 1/16 of an inch. We'll again put our 2 little tick marks, so we know we're talking about inches. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. That'll guide you through the basics of a measuring tape in imperial measurements and how it's divided into fractions and 1/16 of an inch at the smallest for most of them. You'll probably say, like, why are we dealing with all these fractions? Once we get to metric measures, I think you'll find this is a lot easier. Metric measures are a lot easier than imperial measures, what we're doing now. But that's why we spent so much time working on fractions before we jumped into this, so that we had the fraction skills to be able to do these imperial measures. It's unfortunate that we have to deal with these, but when you live next to the United States that hasn't adopted the metric system, a lot of our building materials are in imperial, are in inches. And so if you're going to be working in any kind of skilled trade, you need to be familiar with inches and measuring in inches and fractions of inches. We can't rely on the metric system, even though it's better and much more effective. We have to use this older, more complicated system, and we have to be familiar with it. And so it's a really good skill to have for the real world. I hope that's been helpful. Talk to you soon, folks. Bye for now.